Hi, welcome back to Human Conversations. We really appreciate the continued support and for your showing up. We've gotten a lot of good feedback that we're going to try to kind of work into this whole experience as well. So thank you for showing up today in this episode. Today we're going to be talking about something I'm extremely passionate about, which is communication styles. We're going to actually acknowledge culture piece to it and also dissect a little bit of like a trauma lens with these communication styles. So we're actually Melanie is gonna start us out with talking about high context versus low context cultural communication, and then we'll kind of get into ways to navigate through communication styles overall. Okay.
Yeah, this is gonna be information packed.
Yeah.
Our first definition today is high context cultures. So basically, these are cultures where they communicate in ways that are implicit and rely heavily on context.
So these are communicators who are used to having a relationship with the other person that they're communicating with, and they emphasize a lot on that relationship with the person. So they utilize silence as a part of really understanding the context of what's going on in the conversation by looking at nonverbals, by understanding their tone of voice and what that means. So this way of communicating is a lot more based off of an understanding of that relationship and that rapport with that person.
And some high context cultures include East Asia, Latin America, Southern Mediterranean, and some Arab countries.
Mm-hmm.
Low context cultures rely heavily on explicit verbal communication.
Right. So we're going to see a big emphasis for low context cultures on the topic of what they're actually talking about. So these communicators usually rely on spoken word or the written word of what's going on. So you see these terms like a lot in professional settings, or if you know, are growing up in a family, you might identify with one of these two. For me, for instance, we rely a lot on, we're pretty much high context cultural communicators in my family. Nonverbals are huge in my family, and it's kind of goes to show like if you have a good relationship with someone, they will listen to you. If you don't, it might be a little bit rocky, right? What about you?
Mm. Well, I just want to add to like low context cultures are more like American, Canadian, and Western European.
Mm-hmm.
So my family, this is kind of where it's a little, I think, definitely family specific as well. We're Mexican American, so technically, culturally, from thinking about from like the Mexican side, it would be high context. But I feel like with my family, because we are very Americanized, we're definitely very much about verbal communication. So that's what it is for me and my family, I would say.
Yeah, so when you go out into the real world with these contexts, one of the major ways to bridge the gap between these two type of communication styles is by creating a space for developing a relationship. So because high context communication focuses on that relationship, what is said and how it is said is better understood and worked through when you do have that rapport. So really bridging the gap by developing an understanding rather than only giving specific explanations, or in order for that low context communicator to build relationships and slow down communication. This is not to say that either of these communication styles are right or wrong. They're just different. And when we have a better understanding of what's going on, we have a better chance or a better opportunity to move through a little bit more flowier or with some flexibility of understanding what's going on and not really taking it as personally. So either one,
Yeah,
you know, go ahead.
I was just going to add like, and if you notice, if you have family where maybe one generation is closer to their culture than another generation, the way that there may be problems communicating between those different generations due to these kinds of factors.
Right. So there's a lot of intersectionality that goes into this. Social location, which are bigger terms too, just mean that when you break a person down, there are different things that contribute to their development, right? Or their styles of communication. So we're now, I think, is a good time to kind of go into the four that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. So there's 4 different kinds of ways of communicating, and I'm going to break it down to real kind of simple definitions. So the first one I'm going to talk about is assertive. So ideally, this is actually the kind of communication we want. And I know that the word assertive has sometimes a bad rep. Definitely, I think socially, women and the word assertive, there's a certain connotation to it sometimes, depending on who you're talking to. But we really want an assertive, like the word assertive is good. We want an assertive communication style. So this is when you, for example, you tell someone how they made you feel in a nice and respectful way. So this is you expressing your emotions clearly and sometimes setting a boundary. So for example, when someone calls you a name, you tell that person that it hurt your feelings when they did that, and you would like for them to please stop. So pretty clear, to the point, right?
Right.
Do you want to add anything about being assertive? Because I know there's a lot there.
Not yet. I do want to say though that although a lot of what we share is going to come from not just the knowledge and experience, but both of those things working with clients. So I think what's important to note that I've kind of moved into this type of space where there are going to be times where we flow through all 4 of these communication styles in our life and in our daily routines, because it's necessary for us to keep ourselves physically and emotionally safe, right? And we're all coming from different trauma backgrounds or different experiences. So when Melanie and I talk about how assertiveness is sort of that goal, it's more to say it as when we do work on ourselves, or when we are wanting some sort of shift within ourselves to integrate different pieces of maybe our experiences, that would be the ultimate kind of healthy version of how we show up for ourselves and for other people. However, it's not to say that we're always going to be that way, because sometimes we do have to use aggressive communication to really keep ourselves emotionally safe or physically safe if something around us is not, is not being
Right.
yeah.
Received,
right? So I just wanted to say that as we go through these, we're going to, always acknowledge that we flow in and out of all of these. But these are going to just be some things to think about and how to integrate that communication style and then move forward.
Also, these 4 communication styles are very much from an American perspective. So just keep that in mind, that these that I'm defining now are very much not necessarily culturally sensitive. They're very Americanized. The next one I'm going to define is passive. So you don't share your feelings with anyone if you're taking more of a passive approach, and you pretend that everything is okay. So for example, someone calls you a name, you pretend that it doesn't bother you, and you never let them know how you feel about that interaction. This can be more of somebody who internalizes things as well. Somebody who internalizes things a lot, they may have more of a passive communication approach. The next one I'm going to talk about is aggressive. So this is when you express your feelings in a mean and sometimes disrespectful way. And again, like what Chelsea said, sometimes it's needed for potentially for safety reasons. So this example would be like someone calls you a name and you call them an even worse name back.
Or you didn't.
Or you get in their face. and try to scare them, because maybe words are not enough. So very aggressive, more manner in that one. You want anything you want to add about aggressive communication?
Could you tell? I just, whenever I talk about this kind of these things, I always find myself wanting to say, yeah, I've been told that I'm aggressive, but it's really, honestly, I'm both. I'm all of these things. I do all of these things. I will say that I have grown in my assertiveness skills, because these are skills and every skill needs to be practiced in order to maintain them. And I think that passive and aggressive really get such a bad rep because they can be seen as weak or too much. And as a woman, being weak or being too much is pretty much those stories that have been placed onto us over all of our lives, like forever. And so I just think it's really important to create space for yourself to have a relationship with those styles and really show them love, because they are there for a reason. They're there to protect you. They're there to kind of help you move into a space where you can eventually get those needs met. But, I don't know. I think also being Afghan and having that whole just very passionate zest for life. I think sometimes my family can come off as a bit confrontive, but we're very passionate about certain things. And so I just kind of wanted to create space for that.
The last one's passive aggressive, and this is when you don't share your feelings, but then you do something to get back at the other person. So an example, somebody calls you a name, you pretend that your feelings are not hurt, but you spread rumors about them to other people. Or, you go and tell other people, like, look what this person did to me. But you're not communicating clearly to the person who did the hurting.
And if you're like me, this one will show up very often in your relationship, your little romantic relationship. And sometimes for me, I would say, if I'm not, I think the reason for me this comes up is because I don't know right away what exactly is bothering me and why it bothered me, which we don't always need to give an explanation. We don't actually have to. But I do think that when I engage in this one, I feel bad because this is like, I'm silently angry at you and I'm stewing, but really I just need to tell you what's going on for me. So that one can get a bit tricky, I think.
For sure. Yeah. This one is very common in many of the couples that I work with. And a lot of it is similar to what you said, where people just don't know how. They know their feelings are hurt, but they don't know why or how or when it happens even. They just know that they feel a certain kind of way, and then they do something to hurt their partner.
Right. And then there's probably fear too, that the other person's going to judge why they're even upset. But that's the problem, is we have to really remind ourselves to stay curious, because we have to have a safe environment to want to continue to share with each other.
Yeah, there's a certain level of vulnerability you do have to accept if you want to be assertive, because you're letting somebody know that they hurt you. And that that places you in a vulnerable place as well.
Yes, exactly. So I think what's most important now, what we're going to talk about, is when we do talk about communication, it's really, really important to acknowledge listening. Listening is the first place to start when it comes to any sort of communication. So this is really relevant right now with everything going on around us and conversations we might be having with significant others, with family members, with colleagues. This is where the bread and butter is. So what I want to acknowledge first is I want to talk about the 12 blocks of listening. So I'm going to name them, and then we'll kind of get into some further things. So we have, so when I talk about this, we're going to, the blocks to listening. I want you, the listener, and just us to think about which ones we might engage in the most when we are listening. So right now, we're not even talking about using our words, right? We're just simply talking about what's coming in on our ears and how are we listening. So this is an opportunity for us to become more aware of our blocks at the time that they actually show up. So we have comparing. So like I've had it harder than you have it or whatever when we're listening.
Mm-hmm.
Mind reading, which is probably what you might see more, Melanie, with your, because you work with couples, and that might be something that shows up a lot. So
Mm-hmm.
like, did that person actually say that, or is that just what you were thinking? We have rehearsing, so already kind of knowing what you're going to say right when the person stops sharing what they're sharing, so you're already kind of rehearsing it in your head. Filtering, when you filter, you listen to some things and not others. So you might pay attention to see if somebody is angry or unhappy, or if you're in emotional danger. This one might show up a lot if you do have a lot of trauma or any trauma. That might be something where you might kind of teeter on filtering when you're listening to someone. There's also judging, right? There's also dreaming about something because someone had said something, and then you start half listening to what they're saying. I've definitely had moments of that. This is a big one. I think especially for therapists, maybe identifying. So, you know, here you take everything someone tells you and then you refer it back to your own experience. That might be a block from you really listening to the other person, because then they end up feeling um, that there's not really time for you to really hear what they were saying, because you're so busy being excited about your own personal experience that you're sharing.
Right.
You also have advising. So, people who love to give, great problem solvers, the person sharing something so vulnerable and emotional with you, and then you go straight into problem solving, right? That might be another one you might see in relationships. And then there's sparring, or I think it's sparring. Is it sparing or sparring? I'm pretty sure it's sparring. Sparring. This is basically the listening block where you're arguing and debating with people.
Oh yeah, definitely
Um,
sparring.
Sparring, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure. So, this one, you know, especially when it comes to leading into that aggressive communication style, this one can really get us into, you know, disconnect in relationships, because the
Mm-hmm.
other person never feels heard, because the other person is so quick to disagree. So they focus on that disagreeing point instead of seeing, the places where they do agree and acknowledging the places where they don't. So in this, you see a lot of put downs and you see a lot of discounting. So discounting is for people who can't stand compliments. That's another piece of, like, if someone's saying something, they're sharing it, and instead of listening to that compliment, they're saying, "Oh, I didn't do that," or um, "It's nice of you to say that, but it's really it was a poor attempt on my end," or something like that, right?
Yeah, so a
So,
lot of defensiveness in this kind of
mm-hmm,
interaction.
mm-hmm. Then there's another block, is being right. So always, being right, so that when you're listening, you go to lengths to avoid being wrong, because you can't listen to criticism and you don't want to be corrected. So you just have to be right. Another one, there's two more here. So there's derailing the conversation, which is not a fair fighting rule when you're trying to get something across to someone. And then placating. Ooh, this one to me is tricky. This is something I definitely always work on to strengthen this skill of knowing when I'm placating. So when someone's like, listening to what you're saying, and then you say, right, right, absolutely, I know, of course, because you want to be nice and supportive and pleasant. Um, but that's half listening, because you're not truly being there, present in the moment. and you're placating rather than tuning in and examining what's being said. So you might also want to gain some sort of, support or strengthen that relationship. So sometimes we engage in these things out of pureness of just wanting to be nice, but it ultimately kind of derails sort of that relationship with the person sometimes, because then we aren't listening truly. We're just engaging in these blocks. So I wanted to go into talking about assertiveness skills, and I wanted to create space for legitimate rights, because a lot of times, like Melanie said, we talk about assertiveness skills and how it can sometimes come off as sort of having this bad rap of, being mean, or what do you think? It kind of,
Yeah, I mean, I think along those lines, like a sense of I feel like when people set boundaries, other people don't like it. So when you're being assertive, you really are being more clear about your boundary setting and, like, I think your thoughts and feelings. And in some cultures, that may be more appropriate than other cultures. And I think
right.
that's sometimes where people get into trouble, or like discomfort anyways, where maybe they're in a culture that's not their own and communicating in a way that's maybe more appropriate to their culture. But since they're in a different culture where that may not be appropriate, there may be some pushback.
Right. So, like we've said, these are things that we're not born with. That's right. It's called a skill, right? So
Mm-hmm. We learn all these things.
Exactly. We learn all these things, and just like any learned behavior or action, it's something that we acquire. It's not a personality trait that we're just magically born with. I definitely was not magically born with these assertiveness skills. But these are what keep us socially, surviving or thriving, or maybe not thriving, right? Maybe we want to work on training ourselves on how to get our needs met while also maintaining friendships. Because sometimes when we don't do this, we might end up being people who, we might make people laugh at a party, but then we go home alone. Or, you think something's going good, but then you still fall short. And that might be having to do with the blocks that are occurring, right? Like, while you're listening, what kind of space are you creating?
Also, though, I feel like just this is important to know because we're talking about culture, but so certain people and places of privilege can use different forms of communication without the same consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So in our culture, I mean, just in American culture, cis white males obviously have more privilege than cisgendered white males, than any other group. And so they can be assertive and not maybe get the same repercussions from their assertive communication style, or even be aggressive and not get the same consequences that maybe a minority person might experience.
Right. And I love that you brought that up, and thank you, because this is putting words to experiences that a lot of people might go through, and we don't realize or pick up in the moment when this is actually happening. And fortunately slash a little bit unfortunately for me, I don't know how I do actually, it's the traumas I've been through, but I am very hyper vigilant and aware of when this is actually taking place in front of me. So I tend to be the person that will say, wait a minute, that wasn't right.
Mm.
So pointing it out in the moment, even if you just start inside your head and you don't say anything, that's important, because then you're actually going through the motions and the process of unlearning these things that we've been so conditioned through culture, through privilege, to see or to experience. So we get to unlearn and dissect for ourselves on the inside first what's going on around us. So I really appreciate Melanie's putting words to what we call and what we've talked about a little bit earlier on as social location. So when someone says, oh, my social location gives me the privilege to blah, blah, blah. She's talking about where someone is positioned in society, whether they're whatever gender, whatever, however they identify, you know, their socioeconomic status, their all of those things. Where does it put them in the context of our culture? Does it, you know, put them high up on a ladder? Does it put them at the bottom of the food chain? You know, where are we all, and how does that impact the way we're communicating, the way that we get to be listened to, all of those things. So
That was a really good definition.
thank you. Oh, I just went off what you just said, so it was really just like an echo of you. So I want to go kind of talk about, because these are things that we're not born with. These are something, obviously, like we felt the need to talk about it because it's something that you can really work on with for yourselves. It's important to acknowledge what are our legitimate rights. And again, in the context of privilege, in the context of your social location, right? We wouldn't want anyone to put themselves in harm's way just to achieve these skills, right? You have to always maintain that safety for yourself. So that goes back to having those boundaries and knowing when and where you can take care of yourself. So, you know, it's really to understand that nothing, these beliefs are essentially a set of like guidelines. It's not this binary of good or bad. It's just understanding, you know, what is something that I'm actually really able to ask for and not feel bad about or not be afraid of, you know. So I'm going to read a few that there's a long list that I have here, and I'm just going to read a few that I feel like could be relevant, most relevant for some people. So I have maybe for some teens or people who identify as being more passive. So mistaken traditional assumption might be, don't be antisocial. People are going to think you don't like them if you say you'd rather be alone instead of with them, right? If you want space. Well, your legitimate right is that you have a right to be alone if you do want space, even if others prefer your company. So, you know, this might go back to people who really want to take space away in their partnership or in their, you know, family, or maybe away from some friends for a little bit to kind of recollect themselves, to ask for that space, right? Another one might be, you should always have a good reason for what you feel and do. Well, you have a right not to have to justify yourself to other people, right? I know sometimes we may not have the privilege to speak up on that, but our legitimate right on the inside is to know that that is a need of ours, and that we have every right to not have to explain ourselves to another person. I know this is one for me. A mistaken assumption might be, it's shameful to make mistakes. You should have an appropriate response for every occasion. Well, you have the right to make mistakes. Actually, mistakes are where we learn, right?
Yeah,
And
I don't even know how you could possibly have what is an appropriate response and like to
right.
every situation. I don't even know how
Mm-hmm.
one person could do that.
Yeah. So these are things, and at the end, I'm gonna actually give you the name of this book that I'm getting some of these resources off of, so that if you do want to work on these skills, it's actually a workbook as well. So it gives you exercises on strengthening these types of skills. So the last part that I want to acknowledge, we're going to talk about responding to criticism, because that's really one of the biggest fears that we face when we do want to make changes on how we communicate, or just maybe even just experiencing something different, right? Because maybe in our relationships, we're finding that we're being met with criticism, with defensiveness, with a lot of harsh sensations that prevent us from continuing moving forward. So when it comes to strengthening these skills, it's really important to use some tips here that might kind of help you move into a space of responding as opposed to reacting to criticism. Okay, I'm just gonna pause real quick. Oh my goodness. I just thought of a song that I absolutely love, and I wonder if anyone has heard of it. My loved one showed me this a little while ago, and I'm like, I can't believe I've lived without this song ever in my life. It's called Perfect 10 featuring Nipsey. He's, you know who that is, right? Nipsey Hussle. Anyways, there's this breakdown that he talks about. We have to change the way we respond or react to, change the way we react to responding to being disrespected. I just love the way he said it. Perfect 10. If you haven't heard that song, please go listen to it. It's amazing. But we're gonna preach Nipsey Hussle right now. So some ways to kind of help us strategize on how we can actually respond instead of react is by acknowledging. So, if someone is giving you, let's say, criticism, right? And you kind of get, I'm going to give you an example. So let's say when you receive criticism with which you agree, whether it is constructive criticism or just unnecessary reminder, acknowledging that the critic is right. So for example, you're saying, "You're right, boss. I do misspell a lot of words and I could use a dictionary at my desk." Or, "Yes, I don't have to report in. That was due last week." So we're acknowledging part of what that person is saying. But we just have to make sure that we don't fall into making excuses or apologizing behavior. That's another thing that maybe as people who identify as maybe being a woman, we might find ourselves getting stuck in loops where we have to apologize all the time, or we notice we are doing that, and then we at the end of the day, if we're continuously saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," I mean, you know how that feels, right? It doesn't feel good. If we're always feeling like we have to say sorry, we have to acknowledge, where's that coming from, One thing I do for myself, I don't know about you, but I do, I replace it with thank you. So when I notice I want to say sorry for whatever reason, I pause. And then I reflect on, is this a legitimate right that I have? Do I need to be apologizing for something that was out of my control? And so I kind of pause and check in with myself, and I replace it with thank you.
I do something similar. Yeah, I will say like, "Thank you for your understanding," or like, "I appreciate your flexibility and understanding on this issue or matter," instead of, because usually I do the same thing. I'm like, is this something did I do anything wrong here where I even need to apologize? Or is it just like me setting a boundary and being clear about it?
Or the best ones are like when you fart or you burp and you're like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." It's like, okay, I understand there's politeness, but it's not like you can truly control that. Like, I don't know. I've always thought that one is quite funny. I know it's generational, but
it's cultural too.
And cultural for sure. I just think it's so funny where these things, really come. I hear you, little doggy.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is clouding. So clouding is a useful technique for dealing with non-constructive or maybe, manipulative criticism that you disagree with. So it can provide a quick way to just relay with statements that have a grain of truth in them, but are intended to mostly be a put down. So when you use clouding, you find something in the critical comment or statement to agree with while inwardly sticking to your own point of view. So this, you can imagine if you're doing this, it can calm the other person down and gets them out of that whole win-lose game when they're giving you a criticism so that they feel like they can win, right? So you might think that clouding is another form of manipulating someone, and it could be. It's better though than being aggressive back to that person that's criticizing you, or being passive and never getting that need expressed. whether it's met is one thing, but expressed is another, right, for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So this one, it does work. It's it can be really hard when it's with a loved one, because I think when we get criticism from a loved one, that's just kind of a whole nother level of experience, wouldn't you say?
I would say that because, it just depends on, I mean, each relationship, so you might communicate differently in each relationship as well, because
Mm-hmm.
certain people are going to trigger certain things in you, and their communication style, each person has maybe very different communication styles, and that you have relations with, so you might respond differently to each one, and those relationships that have more kind of like risk involved because it's more meaningful, those are going to be where it gets harder to communicate in.
Yeah, exactly. So with clouding, there are three ways that you can agree with your critic, or whoever it is that might be giving us that energy. You can agree in part, you can agree in probability, or you can agree in a principle. So again, I'm going to give the resource, and you can kind of dive more into this as we, after this, after you listen to this. But for instance, agreeing in part. So critic, you're always working. You think the world would fall apart if you took a day off. And then you could say, yes, I do work a lot. Um, or agreeing in principle. If you don't study more than you do now, you're going to fail all of your classes. And you can say, you're right. If I don't study, I will fail my classes, right? So you're agreeing in principle, but you're not necessarily agreeing that you're going to fail in that moment. So these are some ways to kind of navigate conversations like that. And then the last part is probing. This one I use when I'm just outing myself so much. It's great. Um, I'd say probing is one I use when I find myself having a physical response to something, because, when you have a physical sensation, that's when you know, okay, you need to slow down the conversation. So assertive probing is useful when you can't tell if the criticism is either constructive or manipulative. And that word is like so strong, right? Manipulative. But when you just don't understand where something's coming from, you want to try to get the more of the story. So often we want to avoid criticism because it doesn't feel good, or it doesn't feel comfortable, or you might already had a long day. And so we can actually get confused when we hear these things and then want to respond back to that person. So when we use probing, we can pick apart what's going on in the situation. So generally, this will be something that affects the person's self-interest. So you can ask, what is it that's bothering you about blah, 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 whatever the critic is saying. You can ask for specific examples, right? Um, what is it that bothers you about blah, blah, blah. So for instance, critic says, you're just not pulling your weight around here. Your work is just subpar. And you can say, what is it about my work that bothers you? And then the person can go into it, right? And then you can have more of an open discussion about what's going on, and hopefully have an actual conversation as opposed to a shutdown back and forth. Because I think sometimes we forget that as soon as someone becomes defensive, that no longer really is a conversation. That's just
Right.
defense. That's a bunch of emotional experiences going on, right?
Yeah, people shut down at that point.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about all this? It's kind of a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just all things we all do very unconsciously, but it is something we all relate to because it's all part of how we live our life, right? We communicate every day, whether we say things to anybody or not, because there's a lot of nonverbals in our culture, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very relevant. It can get overwhelming though, thinking about the specifics about all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I think for some people, it may be overwhelming to start thinking about their own communication in such detail. Sometimes, it's hard to look in the mirror and looking at, and especially if you feel like you're doing a lot of these things that maybe are leading to unhealthy communication, sometimes ignorance is bliss.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
I definitely think for me and my experience of life, I think it's been important to know how much my experiences from the past influence my current experiences in the future or in the present, and how to navigate through that when there's emotions present versus when I may just be tired. I don't know. There's just a lot of different things that go into it. So I think the number one thing to always remember is to extend compassion to yourself, and really give yourself space to be curious. And those things are a lot easier said than done. They're just like assertiveness skills where you kind of have to practice them sometimes, especially if you've been through a lot in your life. Having rituals.
Just going off that, when you never learned how to effectively or helpfully communicate, then for sure it's going to be a learning process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it always will be, because everyone is different in this life. Anytime you meet someone new, they're going to have their own lens that they're looking at their language through, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to say this, some of the information that I was able to kind of spit out to you today was from a book that has helped me really throughout the process of my communication journey. It's called Messages, the Communication Skill Book, and it's the third edition, by Matthew McKay, Martha Davis, and Patrick Fanning. It's like Melanie said, this is a very Americanized, privileged, resource. What I like about it is that it really breaks things down, and it even says how it's one thing to know all this information, but it's another thing to do it. And so this book is an actual self-help like workbook that you can read the examples, apply it to your life, and then figure out where it is that you can strengthen certain skills that maybe you use to help yourself in a different way. And then you can actually make note of it in the book, or however you like to kind of engage with workbooks. But it goes into, in the back of the book, it actually talks more specifically with, intimate partners or family dynamics. It gives a ton of examples, talks about public skills and, with other people that we may need to be, or even if it's public speaking, things like that. I really liked it for my own growth. I think it's really helped me effectively and compassionately create more space for myself and other people, because ultimately when we're able to communicate our needs, we can have more successful relationships because we're getting our needs met, and we're also acknowledging that for ourselves. We're having that healthy communication with ourselves to know when we need to speak up versus when we might need to just take space and feel okay with that.
Yeah.
I think that was a lot for when I think we're,
yeah. I think we're in a good place to end, that we don't want to overload the people with too much content.
The people.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for listening into this episode. We definitely, I learned some new things, so I'm sure everybody else did.
And thank you so much if you've been following along. Let us know if you'd like to DM us on our Instagram podcast, Human Conversations. You can just kind of search us up, and if there are any questions or anything like that you'd like to offer us, we'd be more than happy to kind of engage in a conversation. So just let us know.
For sure. And also feel free to share our wonderful podcast with all of your lovely friends, family, enemies, anybody you think might benefit from it.
All of the people.
All of the people. All righty.
Thank
Till
you.
next time.
Next time.